Tell me when we're. Good afternoon. So we are thrilled to be presenting the CRSJ webinar, Tipping the Scales of Justice, the Role Legal Professionals Play in Ensuring Equality at Every Size. So this panel is one of many in a series of rapid response webinars. We're actively planning additional programming on a variety of issues, so please visit americanbar.org/CRSJ for updates on these programs. First, thanks to our ABA co-sponsors, the ABA Center for Public Interest Law, Commission on Disability Rights, Commission on Hispanic Legal Rights and Responsibilities, Commission on Racial and Ethnic Diversity in the Profession, Commission on Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity, and the ABA Senior Lawyers Division. During today's program, we encourage you to ask questions of our panelists through the Q&A, not the chat function. If you do not see the controls, please ensure your screen is not idle. I'll be monitoring the Q&A and we'll do our best to address them time permitting. We will be sharing a recording of this program with everyone who has registered so that you can share it widely within your networks. So it gives me great pleasure, and I'm honored and humbled to moderate this event and to work with these superstar saint panelists from the National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance and the Fat Legal Advocacy, Rights, and Education Project. I'm Nick Lawson, your moderator. I'm an MD-JD, a Georgetown Law Scholar, immediate past commissioner at the ABA Commission on Disability Rights, and a professor with a disability who had the privilege of interviewing today's panelists for a just published article in Truro Law Review called Fat Rights, Public Health Oppression and Prejudice, and the Obesity Epidemic in scare quotes. I'll be with you again in 1 hour to facilitate discussion. So to get us started, let me introduce the first member of our panel, Tigris Osborne. Tigris is the chair of the National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance, the world's longest running organization working towards equality at every size. She's also the host of the NAFA webinar series. Tigris has been a body liberation activist for over a dozen years, including producing fat-positive community events in several cities. A two-time women's college grad, Smith and Mills, Tigris holds degrees in Black Studies and English. He has a background in youth advocacy, diversity education, and college counseling with low-income populations. She has recently been featured discussing fat rights on ABC News and in USA Today. And now, Tigris.
Thanks, Nick. Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be with you today. We're going to start with a presentation where I give some overview and orientation for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Fat Liberation Movement and the Fat Rights Movement and what we are all about. Then introduce my two colleagues who are legal professionals to share some insights with you. So first of all, let's start with what we will cover in this presentation. We're going to talk about, as I said, what fat liberation is, what the movement is all about, and what are the roles that NAFA and the FLAIR Project play in this movement. Then we're going to talk about how anti-fatness is an intersectional social justice issue that anyone who is concerned about social justice should be treating as a priority. And finally, we're going to talk about how people in your profession as legal professionals can support and promote the concept of equality at every size. What we are not going to talk about in this presentation, we are regularly confronted by everyone from trolls to medical professionals with the idea that talking about fat people as human beings who deserve equity and fair treatment is a form of glorifying obesity. Talk a little bit more about what's problematic about the term obesity in just a minute. But we certainly are happy to glorify the lives and existence of fat people as we glorify and celebrate people in all body types. So we're not ashamed to glorify fatness, but we'll talk about the word obesity in just a minute. So we're not going to focus on that today. We also find that whenever we talk about fat people and our rights, people bring up the issue of health. Now, certainly we are going to talk about ways in which access to health promoting care and opportunities and supports is impacted by anti-fatness. But what we're not going to talk about is individual fat people's health and what that has to do with their bodies. Now, again, This is so pervasive that I feel the need when I make presentations to re-emphasize it. We are not here today to talk about whether or not fat people are healthy. We are here today to talk about whether or not fat people deserve fair treatment. In fact, we are here to talk about exclusively why fat people do deserve fair treatment. So again, health is going to come up in a couple of places in this presentation because there are ways that it is that the health systems are part of the systemic oppression that fat people face. But once again, we're not going to be talking individually about fat people's health profiles, and that's all that really needs to be said about that. Before we go any further, I just want to emphasize that, as you can tell from the name of our organization, we unapologetically and enthusiastically use the word fat. We believe that fat can be used and should be used as a neutral description, the same way you would describe another physical characteristic. You might call someone blonde, you might call someone tall, you might call someone fat. Now, we also acknowledge the reality that fat is a word that can be laced with trauma for many people because of the anti-fat ways in which we use the word in our culture. So we do want to acknowledge that. We acknowledge that there are spaces where you may not yet feel comfortable using the word fat, and we ask you to examine that. And we know that there are times when you won't want to use it because of the impact it might have on others. Again, we ask you to examine that. But for today's purposes, we will be using the word. In our movement, we use it consistently. And so this is a bit of a trigger warning for any of you who do have that personal trauma with the word, that it's going to come up a lot in this presentation. The words that we don't use are what we in our movement call the O words, and you will often see them from activists in fat rights, either asterisked out or hyphened out. Those words are overweight and obesity. It is really difficult to refrain from using that terminology at all when we are talking about the medical establishment and when we're talking about the legal establishment. But for our purposes as fat liberationists, our belief is that the term overweight implies that there is a particular weight that is the right and appropriate weight, which one may be over or under. We reject that notion. We also believe that the term obesity, especially as a medical designation, is problematic and pathologizing to fat people. You may or may not know that even the American Medical Association had controversy about designating obesity as a disease, doing so against the advice of their own internal committee about whether or not to do so. For our purposes, this is a worm that creates a lot of harm for fat people. And so we prefer to just avoid using it whenever possible. When we do use it, know that it is in quotation marks because we are quoting somebody else who we haven't been able to bring along yet around shifting that use. Now, what is the Fat Liberation Movement? And what do NAFA and FLAIR have to do with it? Well, first of all, I often get asked, is fat liberation the same thing as body positivity? And the answer is yes and no. In Fat Liberation Movement, we definitely want people to feel positive about their bodies and the bodies of others if they can. We acknowledge that that body neutrality might be a more realistic approach for people who are challenged, disenfranchised, oppressed because of their bodies. But at the very least, we want to be putting forward a politic, personal and community politic that encourages people to feel good in their bodies as much as possible. But what people are actually usually asking is this like that movement that started on Tumblr and Instagram in the early 2000s where we all feel good about ourselves? And the answer to that is no. Fat liberation is a grand elder of the body positivity movement, and the term body positivity has been used since at least the 1990s. But when we talk about that movement that started on social media, what we're talking about is a movement of self-created media by people who were not represented in mainstream media, and certainly Fat Liberation is that. But what we are also talking about is a movement that was then co-opted, watered down, and mainstreamed, and that focuses too much of its attention on personal feelings about the body, and not enough of its attention on systemic oppression and the way that affects people in their bodies. So in that way, Fat Liberation is a political movement that focuses on systemic oppression, where body positivity often defaults to the individual, including in ways that allow people to do anti-fat things and then claim that they are body positive because they make them feel good. We don't do that. So, fat liberation is a movement to respect fat bodies as a natural part of human diversity. There are all kinds of bodies in the world. They work in all kinds of different ways and they look all kinds of different ways, and fat is just another one of them. Fat liberation is also a movement to fight injustice based on arbitrary standards of weight, size, shape, or any combination thereof. So a lot of our work is guided by a foundational document that was created in the early 1970s by the Fat Underground, a group of radical feminists who asserted unequivocally that fat people deserve human respect and recognition. The Fat Underground also asserted that fat people deserve equal rights, as promised in the Constitution of the United States. Now, this document, the Fat Liberation Manifesto, which you can easily find online, has been embraced by people from all over the world. So it's not always the Constitution of the US that we're talking about. But here today with the American Bar Association, of course, we're going to be talking about how this affects us in the US. When it comes to NAFA, pardon me, we actually predate the Fat Underground by just a couple of years, and NAFA is a little different than the Fat Underground in that it starts with less of a very direct focus on the politics and on dismantling the system. But NAFA's mission has always been, pardon me, to change perceptions of fat and to end size discrimination through education, advocacy, and support. NAFA was founded in 1969 by a small group of fat people and their friends and loved ones, led by Bill Fabry, who was inspired to do something about the mistreatment he saw his fat wife receiving in the world. So NAFA launches in the same epic summer of civil rights progress and important movements, including everything from the Stonewall Rebellion to the Alcatraz occupation, and including huge cultural moments like the moon landing and the creation of Sesame Street. And we've been at this work ever since then. We feel it's important to emphasize that while we are known as the world's first documented fat rights organization, this does not mean that NAFA's founding is the beginning of fat rights. NAFA's founding is inspired by work in other civil rights movements, by the work of radical feminists, even before the Fat Underground, and by the sort of fat-ass badassery of individual people, from artists to leaders in other progressive movements, in particular, Black women and femmes in the US civil rights movement, who are out in the forefront, in their living their lives, in their fat bodies, doing their work, advocating for others. So we always want to honor them. It's not that we were first just because we were the first one with an incorporation, but that is how we trace our origin story. Our vision is a culture in which fat people are celebrated and liberated from every form of oppression. And that every form of oppression piece is essential to the intersectionality of today's fat liberation movement. NAFA actually has to own that we have had a lot of work to do over the years of becoming more intersectional in our vision and truly coming to understand what we hope you will all understand today, which is that if we create a world that's a little more tolerant around the size of bodies, but we still have racial oppression. We still have gender oppression. We still have oppression based on people's sexual orientation or disabilities or any other kinds of identities. That still impacts fat people. So therefore, fat people are not free. We are not free, in the famous words of Fannie Lou Hamer, until we are all free. And so this is where our intersectional inspiration comes from today. Project FLARE is the Fat Legal Advocacy, Rights, and Education Project, and you're going to be hearing in more detail from Sondra Solovay, the project's director, later in today's presentation. And they are dedicated as well to making the lives of higher weight individuals better through advocacy, through legal action, and through education. So how is anti-fatness an intersectional social justice issue? Well, as we said when talking about body positivity, anti-fatness is not just interpersonal. Anti-fatness is institutional and systemic. And I'll pause here to say that you may often hear people using the term fat phobia instead of the term anti-fatness. As fat liberationists, we're leaning into using this terminology, anti-fatness, because we hear from our colleagues and partners in disability rights movement that it is ableist to use a term like phobia for something that's not actually a phobia. So you'll be hearing me use the term anti-fatness in this presentation. Fat itself is colonized and medicalized and criminalized. And anti-fatness is normalized in our culture. It is internalized and it is systematic. Anti-fatness is not, however, the last acceptable form of prejudice. What we often hear from people who are beginning to understand just how pervasive anti-fatness is in the culture is, oh, well, that sounds like you can still get away with that with fat people in ways that you couldn't get away with that with Black people, or you couldn't get away with that with gay people. You can tell that joke, you can make that insult, you can do that thing to fat people that you would never be able to do to those other people. First of all, if you're paying attention, you can see ample evidence in our culture that there are many forms of prejudice that are still fully acceptable. Second of all, if you're paying attention, you will also note that, as I talked about before, there are fat people in all of those other identity groups, which means that they are certainly aware of the ways that even though they are experiencing anti-fatness in the world, they are also experiencing racism and sexism and trans bias and other kinds of discrimination. So we never want to play that last acceptable prejudice card, because there's no need for us to make those kinds of comparisons with other social justice issues. In fact, anti-fatness is a part of all of those other social justice issues in one way or another. What is true is that there is a legal difference, especially in the United States, but also across the globe, in terms of what protections are available explicitly around some of those other identities in ways that they are not available around fatness. There are only a handful of places in the world that have laws explicitly prohibiting size discrimination. And when size discrimination is legal, anti-fatness can actually be used as a sort of backdoor way of enacting some of those other kinds of discrimination. So in the United States, there are 2 states. There is no federal law explicitly protecting fat people. In the United States, there are 2 states that have some form of protections. In the state of Michigan, the Elliott-Larsen Civil Rights Act has included the terminology height and weight as protected classes since the late 1970s. In the state of Washington in 2019, the Supreme Court ruled that obesity is a form of disability that is protected by Washington's law against disability, which is well, I tell lay people audiences that it's very similar to what you might know as the American with Disabilities Act, but it's their state law. I'm sure some of y'all know some of the finer differences there. But that piece around whether fatness, or in the words of the law and the medical establishment, obesity, about whether or not that is a disability, that piece is highly debated by everyone from disability rights activists to lawyers. And from our perspective, what we want to see is explicit protections that are based on body size, regardless of whether it's designated as a disability or not. Having said that, wherever disability law is available to fat people to use as a resource in solving problems with the legal system, we encourage fat people to use every available tool in the toolbox. But what we want to do is build a more robust toolbox that includes more places where fatness is a protected category. There are a handful of cities as well in the United States that have enacted some version of appearance-based protections, either explicitly designating height or weight or combinations thereof as protected classes, or by having physical appearance laws that protect people against discrimination based on what they look like, and that include weight or perceptions of weight as part of those protections. In the meantime, there is pending legislation in a few places in the country, and part of what we're doing at NAFA these days is analyzing where else we should pursue such legislations, where we have the greatest chance of success in pursuing more legislation that enacts protections towards fat rights. Right now, the state of Massachusetts is considering such legislation, which would cover about 6.8 million people. The state of New Jersey is considering such legislation, which would cover about 9.3 million people. The state of New York is considering such legislation, which would cover about 20 million people statewide. And the city of New York is considering human rights legislation, which would protect about 8.3 million people. Now, you'll note, probably if you know anything about the population of those places, that I'm talking about the population of the entire place, not just the number of fat people. We know that across the country, fat people, based on medical designations of what is fat and what is not, which are flawed. But based on those designations, we know that at least 60% of Americans are considered fat. But we don't think that these laws only protect the 60% of Americans who actually are fat. Or who actually are labeled as fat. We think these laws actually protect all Americans because, and all people experiencing life in America, because anti-fatness is sometimes contextual. So certainly there are people who every day of their life experience anti-fatness because of the fat bodies that they live in. And then there are also scenarios in which people who wouldn't be perceived as fat in another context, for example, airline stewardesses, may be perceived as fat in a particular context. We want everybody to be protected from the idea that body shape and size is something that they can be discriminated based upon. So for us, we have a 50-50 vision that one day there will be 50 states with state laws, or that really we will get to a point where we've accomplished the dream, which is a Title VII amendment that adds height and weight to protected classes at a federal level. But right now, we don't think it's realistic to pursue federal legislation. We think the tide is turning quickly. There's lots of information, lots of research that tells us that American attitudes are changing, even as Americans remain anti-fat in some of their social attitudes, that their attitudes about whether or not it should be legal to discriminate based on that are changing. We're evaluating things like, is it better to consider the states with the highest population of fat people, or is it better to consider the states with the most likelihood, based on their political landscape, of seeing the law passed? And we're in the process of doing that analysis, and we'll invite you, if you have skills in those areas, to step forward to volunteer to assist us with that analysis. But in the meantime, we are working to build coalition in those states that already have pending legislation, so that we can hopefully see that by the end of 2023, we will see a few more states on this list the next time we make a presentation like this. It is really important, once again, that as we pursue fat rights, that we remember that we have to do that intersectionally, and we have to do that in coalition with other social justice movements. This is not competition for resources. This is not a choice between one kind of civil rights and another kind of civil rights because there's only a limited amount of civil rights. This is an expansive approach that says we have to work in partnership with the other people who are fighting for their rights too. Who we don't have to work in partnership, but who has expressed tremendous interest in involving themselves in this kind of movement at this stage of the game, are the medical anti-obesity organizations. You will encounter, if you know anything about these organizations or if you are exposed to them, that right now they're talking a lot about the concept of weight stigma. And our belief is that they are talking about weight stigma because they see making themselves friendlier as a way to get more people into their systems for highly expensive treatments. These organizations are often founded by pharmaceutical diet companies or funded by pharmaceutical diet companies, sometimes very much so behind the scenes. But we believe that the pursuit of treatment for obesity is actually against some of the best science that we have when we do weight neutral science. And that it is, again, pathologizing and creates further stigma for fat people. So these are not the partnerships that we're trying to build when we think about coalition building to change these laws. It's important to note that Black and Brown communities are disproportionately fat, and we know this when we look at statistics about how people are designated as fat. But it is also important to know that Black and Brown communities are disproportionately impacted by anti-fatness. And part of the reason for that is because anti-fatness is actually rooted in anti-Blackness, especially as we understand it in the United States and in the white Western world. We owe Dr. Sabrina Strings and scholar Deshaun Harrison a lot in terms of helping us understand the ways in which the construction of fat as problematic in our culture is deeply connected to the construction of a racialized body and the juxtaposition of that body with white purity. So when we talk about Black and Brown people, um, we know that what they are experiencing a form of anti-fatness that is even more pervasive, even more rooting against them and rooted in biases against them. We know this to be true for Black Americans. We also know this to be true for Indigenous Americans, whose bodies were colonized, whose diets were colonized, and then who, again, were pitted up against a sort of body ideal that was based in everything that they are not. So we want to be particularly attentive to the needs of those communities as we talk about anti-fatness. And so anti-fatness is a racial injustice issue. It is not separate. We're not, again, we should be concentrating on racism and not anti-fatness. Racism is a higher level concern right now than anti-fatness. The reason it is not is because anti-fatness is a form of racism. So if you care about racial injustice, you want to be learning more about anti-fatness. And Deshaun, the scholar just quoted on the last screen, also talks about how even when people who are not Black are experiencing anti-fatness, what they're actually experiencing is sort of the residue of anti-Blackness. It's really important to understand this as we approach our work in these communities, and how, as we think about the ways in which the impacts of the so-called obesity epidemic affect those communities. Anti-fatness is, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to actually take you through several areas of other civil rights and identity issues and give you one or two examples of how anti-fatness shows up in those places. And I'm going to go pretty quickly because we're just doing a broad overview here, not a deep dive. But what I want you to understand is the examples I'm giving you are not the only examples in each of these categories. They're just meant to get you thinking, if you haven't thought about it, of some ways it would show up. And I'm sure as you think about it more, you will notice other ways that it shows up in these areas. So one example of how anti-fatness is a disability injustice issue is that access to public accommodations and access to not just medical treatment, but even to accessibility aids is complicated by having a fat body. It is harder to get a wheelchair your size, or a walker your size, or something that you need to help you that is rated for a person of your weight, in order to remain safe. So that's one way that it shows up in terms of disability and justice. In terms of public accommodation, everything from whether you can sit at a table in a restaurant to whether you can get out of your car as parking spaces get tighter, has to do with public accommodation and equity for fat people and opportunity to move about the world. When we talk about gender, we know that there are sociocultural pressures around cisgender identities, male and female cisgender identities, that show up as greater pressures for women in some ways. That's true in terms of economic injustice. It's true in terms of workplace opportunity. It's true in a lot of different areas. So certainly there are gender justice issues that are involved. And the gender justice issues are not only gender justice for cisgender women. There are also justice issues related to non-binary and transgender gender identities, in particular, cutoffs for access to gender-affirming surgery that are related to a person's body mass index, or BMI. In terms of economic injustice, research shows us that fat people get paid less on their jobs, even when everything else is equalized, and that fat people have fewer opportunities for advancement and are discriminated against in hiring. That has a cumulative effect over a lifetime of thousands and thousands of dollars for fat people. And of course, if that is layered on top of other areas of wealth gap and gender injustice, then people are being hit in double, triple, quadruple, and more ways. In terms of educational access, bias in education affects fat people in everything from perceptions of whether or not we are able to complete higher level education work, such as advanced degrees, to simple matters of whether we can be in a classroom, whether there's a bathroom on campus that fits a larger person's body, whether we ever see ourselves reflected in the people who are leading us in our education, and so on. In terms of medical injustice, we know that there are problems both in the lack of weight neutral research, creating ideas about fat that are at best problematic and at worst life threatening. We also know that access to medical equipment, everything from MRIs to mammogram machines, can be made difficult for people who are living in fat bodies because the equipment is not made for us and because people are not trained to direct us to where there is equipment that is available that works for us. In terms of immigration, the idea of the national body shows up, the body ideal of an American shows up in terms of who we see as those people versus who we see as our people. And it affects immigration policy in a variety of ways. It also affects immigrants in the ways that they deal with the criminal justice system, which we'll talk about a little bit more in just a moment. In terms of family rights, everything from how your divorce case is settled to who your children get to live with may be impacted by people's perception of your fat and what it means about your personality and your abilities. In terms of the carceral system, we pride ourselves on being a country where we treat prisoners as fairly and humanely as possible. And yet we have no consideration for larger bodied prisoners in terms of what their physical needs are while they are incarcerated. That can range from everything from prisoner uniforms to bed sizes. We also know that people in fat bodies are treated differently in the criminal justice system in every area from being defendants to being criminal justice attorneys. So everywhere across the system, we know that there is bias in terms of policing, in terms of courts, that shows up related to what bodies people show up in. So again, that's a quick hit list, right? Brandy and Elaine will give some more specific examples from their legal experience about where we see these things showing up and how they've been handled according to the laws that exist now, and how we would like to see legal professionals help with creativity around how to handle these things. But again, in the wise words of the Fat Liberation Manifesto, the important piece here is that the struggles that fat people have are connected to other oppressed groups in all of these many, many ways. So what does this mean to you as legal professionals? First of all, we want to challenge you not to just be not anti-fat, not to just be like, I don't hate fat people, I think fat people are okay, or I feel neutral about fat people. We want to challenge you to go further than that and to be actively supporting fat liberation in the work that you do in whatever ways that you can. Sonia Renee Taylor, who is a brilliant artist and organizer who works around issues of radical self-love, reminds us that what the government allows and sanctions and ignores and criminalizes shapes the way that we feel about fat bodies, about all bodies, in this case, fat bodies. And so we know that what you work on in your profession helps influence the way that other people think about us. So some tips. First of all, include fat people in your lens. What I mean by that is when you're looking around your work, where do you see fat people in contexts that are not related to weight loss? And where don't you see fat people? And what does that mean? Include fat people in your media. If you have responsibilities that have to do with how your law firm or your office or your workplaces where you're doing other work in the community, if you have responsibilities related to how people are seen, and there are no fat people anywhere in any of the things that you create, what is the message that you are sending to fat people who are potential clients or who may be looking to you for support? Make sure that you're including fat people in your physical settings. As more and more of us are dealing with physical settings again, despite the fact that we're not doing so today as much, when you have a meeting, are there chairs that hold fat people? Are there chairs that are wide enough for fat people that don't have arms digging into them? Are the tables so close together that no fat person could ever navigate that space? Is there a bathroom stall that's big enough for a larger person? And is the parking that's available big enough for someone who's larger to get out of their car? All of those physical setting things are really important. Include us in your policies and procedures. When you're thinking about what to prioritize in terms of social justice issues in your work, include fat people. When you're thinking about things like the corporate culture of your workplace, think about how diet culture shows up there and what those messages mean to people who are living in marginalized bodies. When you're thinking about how to spend your money individually or in your collective spaces, think about supporting fat liberation work and all the ways that that has ripple effects on your community. And finally, when you look around your spaces, when you look around this Zoom room, when we all turn our cameras on at the end, or when you look around your physical spaces, if you don't see any fat faces or any fat bodies, you have some questions to ask yourself about what that means in terms of the education it requires to get to the place you are in your career, about what kind of attitudes people in your workplace or in other places where you serve have about fat people and whether or not fat people are welcomed. And again, in terms of things like the physical settings and whether they are welcoming. So the number one thing that you can do is include fat people. All of those other ways are ways of saying include fat people in the things that you do at all times. And when we're not included, ask the hard questions about why. So I want to wrap up this portion of the presentation with some very wise words from Sondra Solovay, who is the founder of the FLAIR project, and you'll be hearing from the current executive director in just a moment. But Sondra wrote a book called Tipping the Scales of Justice, and of course this workshop's title was a nod to Sondra's incredible and important work with her permission, and Sondra points out that even though there's not explicit law everywhere in the United States, there actually are ways that courts could already be using current law to end unnecessary discrimination against fat people, but they just lack the vision. So part of what we hope we're challenging you to do today is have that vision. When you have that vision, you help to shift everyone else's vision, and you help us get to a freer world for people in all body sizes. For further learning, I just want to point out the books that I've referenced. Of course, I also referenced the Fat Liberation Manifesto, which, as I mentioned, is very easy to find anywhere online. The Fearing the Black Body, The Racial Origins of Fat Phobia by Sabrina Strings, Belly of the Beast, The Politics of Anti-Fatness as Anti-Blackness by Deshawn L. Harrison, and The Body is Not Apology by Sonia Renee Taylor. And then, of course, Tipping the Scales of Justice by Sondra Solovay, which unfortunately, even though it was written in the 90s, is still very, very relevant today. So we're hoping that with the help of people like you all, in the next few years, we're going to make more things in Sondra's book obsolete. But right now, this is your best handbook for understanding issues around fat and the law, for getting started understanding that. And of course, you've seen in registering for this workshop, Nick wrote a great article for the law review that you should check out, and there are some other articles on this topic that are helpful to you as well. But certainly, Sondra's book is the best starting place for my money. And now I'm going to introduce you to these colleagues who are going to tell you a little bit more. One more place where you can do some learning is NAFA's own webinar series, which does feature a few episodes that are about these specific legal issues and legislative issues, but also features about 50 episodes that are about all areas of fat life, everything from why murder mystery podcasts are so popular right now to what it looks like to be a fat political cartoonist. And it's a great way to get to know some issues that are happening in fat community, just so that you can learn more about what fat liberation is in addition to these specific legal pieces. And here is how you can keep in touch. If you have follow-up questions that we don't get to today, you're welcome to reach out to me directly at the National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance, NAAFA.org. And And then I'm going to introduce Brandy and Elaine to you, and then after their brief presentations, we'll have some time for follow-up questions. Oops. And Brandy Solovay is a fat, legally blind disability and immigration attorney. She is the director of FLAIR, the Fat Legal Advocacy, Rights, and Education Project. In addition to her work with FLAIR, she is the supervising immigration attorney at Homeless Advocacy Project and supervises the legal department at Independent Living Resource Center San Francisco. Brandy also has a background in criminal defense. Brandy graduated from John F. Kennedy University and is licensed to practice in California. After Brandy shares some insights, she's going to pass the mic to Elaine Lee, JD. Elaine joined the board of directors of NAFA in 2020. She's a fat activist, patent attorney, and computer engineer. Elaine has been a fat liberationist for over 20 years now and has previously served as the co-president of the board of directors of No Lose, a national nonprofit organization committed to fat liberation and eliminating hatred, prejudice, and discrimination towards fat people. She earned her Juris Doctor from the University of Wisconsin at Madison and a Bachelor of Science in Computer Science and Engineering from Cornell University. Elaine is licensed to practice law in the states of California, Illinois, and Wisconsin, and is a registered patent attorney before the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. So I'm going to hand the mic now to Brandy, and then she will pass it to Elaine. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Tigress, for that amazing slideshow presentation and for my introduction. As Tigress said, I am the director of Fat Legal Advocacy, Rights, and Education Project, which we also call FLAIR in short. And that project, as Tigress mentioned, was started by attorney Sondra Solovay. So at FLAIR, we provide consultations to individuals who are facing discrimination based on their weight. And these consultations and advocacy cover a lot of different topics, from child custody to education, public accommodations, healthcare, employment, landlord-tenant law, just to name a few. We also provide consultations to attorneys who are advocating for higher weight clients, or also who may be working on changing laws in different jurisdictions. We can definitely consult on legal strategy, media strategy, and political strategy. So if you're interested, you should definitely reach out to us. We prioritize high impact cases and individuals at the intersections. So as Tigress was mentioning before, fat individuals who are also maybe people of color or queer or disabled people. In addition to providing individualized consultations or legal assistance, we also work to change policies, laws, and regulations. When Sondra was the director of FLAIR, she was instrumental in passing the law in San Francisco and writing the regulations of the law in San Francisco. So it's the San Francisco height weight law. And that law actually became basically instrumental in like other cities passing laws as well. So FLAIR has continued work on policy. Right now, we're working with NAFA on some of the states that Tigress were talking about, such as the New York and New Jersey legislation, as well as New York City. FLAIR also collaborates with and guides organizations working on weight justice issues. Working in collaboration is actually one of our favorite ways to work. And so I want to share a story. We recently, during the pandemic, worked with disability and aging organizations on making changes in the California Crisis Care Guidelines, as well as on vaccine access. This was really successful originally when the California Crisis Care Guidelines came out. They were very discriminatory based on people's disabilities or health conditions or people's weights. And so I just want to read a portion of the key points from the new guidelines, which was a result of our collaboration and advocacy with these different groups. So from California Crisis Care Guidelines, it says healthcare decisions, including allocations of scarce resources, cannot be based on age, race, disability, including weight-related disabilities and chronic medical conditions, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, ethnicity, including national origin and language spoken, ability to pay, weight, size, social economic status, insurance status, perceived self-worth, perceived quality of life, immigration status, incarceration status, homelessness, or past or future use of resources. So we definitely saw that as a huge success in California. FLAIR is currently working on 2 important medical access projects. The first project we're working on with Reagan Chastain, and this project sort of has 2 parts. So this is our imaging project. The first part of the imaging project is to create a list of where higher weight capacity machines exist. Such a list doesn't exist at the moment. And in fact, doctors have no idea where these machines are, as well as the people who are working at the locations where the machines are located. They often don't know the weight capacity or measurements of their machine, as well as the operators of the machine often don't know, which creates a huge problem because the burden is on the patient to figure out where they can go for imaging, which should not be the case. And then the second part of that project is to work with manufacturers to create machines with higher weight capacities. So currently, we're lucky if we can find a few machines in a few states that have a 500-pound weight capacity. And a 500-pound weight capacity leaves out a lot of fat people. And in fact, it leaves people in a worse position than they would have been before these machines existed, because before these machines existed, there would be other testing or other ways to figure out maybe what someone's diagnosis is. But now doctors really, really rely on these imaging machines. So it's important that everyone can have access to these imaging machines, no matter the weight, or their shape or measurements of their bodies or disabilities. So that's one thing that FLAIR is working to do right now. The second medical access project is around blanket BMI cutoffs. So there are a lot of blanket BMI cutoffs, which are very arbitrary. They don't take into account someone's specific medical conditions. They just take into account what your BMI is and have a cutoff. So for example, for mini surgeries, maybe the cutoff is 35 or 45. This can come into play when it comes to knee replacement surgeries, IVF treatment, gender confirming surgeries, or even organ transplants. So for instance, in order to receive an organ transplant, there's a BMI cutoff of 35. Now, BMI is very problematic in itself, but even if you have your own donor who's maybe your friend or your family member and they want to donate their kidneys to you, if your BMI is more than 35, it will not happen. And I cannot tell you the amount of people that have talked to FLAIR over the years who are sadly no longer with us because they couldn't get that organ transplant because of some blanket BMI that took like their health condition into account, not at all. So we would love for attorneys and legal workers to get involved and to become more informed about the issues. So thank you for being here today. This is a really great start. If you would like to volunteer with Flair, or you want our input on anything, please, as I said, feel free to reach out directly to us. If you're an attorney or work or volunteer in the legal field and you would like to be in the loop, please join Flair's lawyer list to receive updates on and issues and activities that Flair is doing. We do not solicit donations from this list. So this is just a practitioner list, just a list for updates on what's going on with the law, what's going on with our project. Also, I just wanted to add that Flair is and always has been a completely volunteer organization. We don't have funding. Our work is all volunteer and done in addition to our paid legal work. So I just want to say thank you so much for being here today. And thank you for your time. And if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A. And now I would like to pass it to Elaine.
Well, thank you, Brandy. And thank you, Tigress and Nicholas and the ABA for having us here today. I'm just here, as Tigress mentioned, I am a board member of NAFA, National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance. I have in my career been worked as a patent attorney and corporate attorney with about 25 years of experience, and I worked in a variety of settings. I've worked in large law firms in Chicago and San Francisco, and I've also worked in-house as a corporate attorney in legal departments in Fortune 500 technology companies in Silicon Valley. So I'm, and I've been a fat activist all, pretty much that entire time. So I have, I just kind of here to bring the perspective that you don't have to, you can have your day job and still be a fat liberation advocate or a fat liberationist. And I'm here to share some of my experience as to, how I've gone about doing that. And you can hopefully, Brandy and Tigress have provided a lot of ideas, and hopefully, you can look at those and find ways in which you can contribute to, fat liberation and towards the cause for equality of people of all sizes. So as a fat activist, I have been on the nonprofit boards of 501c3 organizations that advocate for equality at every size. Obviously, the first one is NAFA, which is what I'm currently on, and the second, I have been the co-president of the board of directors of No Lose, which is a 501c3 organization. It's probably about 20 or so, maybe close to 25 years old, and they were originally known as the National Organization for Lesbians of Size. Now it's just basically No Lose, and they are Fat Liberation organization, which was founded by, as the name says, fat lesbians, and have been very strong with LGBTQIA plus advocacy, and very strongly promoting rights and advocacy for fat folks and LGBTQIA rights. So I think as my experience being on those nonprofit boards is that they are, there's obviously there's lots of people with amazing skill sets in many different areas, and they obviously have a strong need for folks with legal skill sets as well. So I've been able to use my legal knowledge to assist these organizations, for example, to help reestablish or apply for 501c3 status And that was for, I've done that for No Lose in the past, because they, they had a need to have that status. It was inadvertently lapsed. So there was another, if they have, like, for example, No Lose has had national conferences. They were having national conferences every year for about 15 years or so. And so they needed, in that context, they need contract negotiation for venues. I mean, that's another area where you can contribute, or, negotiating for contracts with the vendors and other things. In NAFA, there were, we do have opportunities where we can advocate for, or we to collaborate and cooperate on anti-discrimination policies with corporations, or we may also have a need for contracts with artists and vendors, or for services. That's another area where, I mean, not necessarily, doing the on the boots legal advocacy work, but it's still important to protect the rights of the nonprofit organization and making sure the nonprofit's functioning properly, and providing, making sure that, rights are properly allocated, just like you would do for any client. So, there are places where you, even if you're, not specializing in civil rights law, or, or torts, or, medical malpractice, or, other areas where you think you could directly impact the lives of fat folks, you can definitely contribute as a corporate attorney, as a transactional lawyer, as an intellectual property lawyer, or any other, other types of law. You can definitely think of ways to contribute. And just like, as I've done pro bono work throughout my legal career, and of course there's always training you can provide, or consultation you can obtain through folks like Flair, or folks at, NAFA. You can reach out to us at NAFA and we can certainly help you. Or there are many other great nonprofit organizations that, you can reach out to for assistance. So those are some areas. Obviously, at NAFA and Flair, they have been involved in legal advocacy work at the state, federal, and local levels to try to get some legislation passed. That's an area where you, as a legal professional, you can certainly contribute, and reach out to the folks in those organizations. And I would also suggest that even if you are on boards of nonprofits and other, that may not be solely focused on fat liberation, or maybe it's one related to children, or could be children's education, or it could be cancer survivors, or other areas, or even there are areas in which you can advocate for fat, make sure that folks of all sizes are able to access the services of those organizations, that the needs of fat children are addressed, or that the needs of fat folks who have cancer, maybe they can access the services of those organizations, that they have like classes, or chairs that would fit them, or things like, just like any type of any fat liberation work, if fat liberationist would work. So that's what I would, that's what I'd suggest. And then just advocating also in your workplace, making sure that you have folks that, chairs of all sizes in your conference rooms, or if you have fat workers that are in positions of visibility in the front office, that you make sure that you have capable folks, but make sure that capable folks of all sizes are represented through all levels of your organization. And also I would say even looking at things like corporate, corporate HR, making sure that fat folks can access, your all hands, things of, clothing that's in their sizes, uniform that's in their sizes, transportation options for fat folks in your organizations or in your facilities. So anyways, I think, that's kind of what I've got. I think there's basically anything in, in your legal career. I think there are, just look at ways in which you can contribute your skills, and look at ways in your organizations, both, nonprofit boards, as well as corporations and law firms, where you can advance the causes of fat folks and folks of all sizes. So thank you. And I will just turn it back to Nicholas at this time so that he can, he can manage the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Really amazing. Thank you so much for being here. So one of my colleagues, Rabia Belt, is here, and I'm gonna get to some of her questions. But I have two things off the bat to get us started in the discussion and Q&A section. And one is, so why do you think that we don't have comprehensive anti-discrimination protections for fat people in this country right now, especially considering they make up a big part of the population, most of the population? And the second is, do you think that politicians would be rewarded for enacting comprehensive anti-discrimination protections for fat people? So, and then I gotta get to Robbie's questions really soon, but just to start us off, anyone have any thoughts?
From a movement perspective, I can say that one of the challenges is that we have historically been a tremendously underfunded movement. We just haven't been able to gather the kind of funding resources that other civil rights movements have been able to gather. Part of that is based in anti-fatness. A part of that is based in the perception of a fat as a mutable characteristic. And so other characteristics can't be changed. We need to attend our resources and money towards those. But you could just lose weight, right? So you don't have to be discriminated against. This is your fault. And so those attitudes, both culturally and internalized, are certainly part of what has historically gotten in the way of advancing more legislation. We also, we know that because of all of those intersectional issues that we talked about, fat people individually are often tremendously under-resourced themselves because of economic discrimination, because of medical discrimination, because of all of those other things. And so it's that certainly impacts our capacity to build a movement. I do think that there is a sea change that has been happening. I think I referenced this briefly during the presentation, that, there's some research now that tells us that even when people still have some personal anti-fat attitudes, they have a shifting belief around whether it's okay to have discrimination be legal, right? So maybe you don't love the idea of being fat yourself, or maybe you think other fat people should lose weight, but you don't necessarily think they should lose their job over that, right? Or you don't necessarily think they should lose their kids over that. So there's a shifting attitude there that I think allows us to build a little bit more groundswell of support. And I do think that for all of the challenges that come along with it, the mainstreaming of body positivity has been part of some of that cultural shift. I think also that, to the question of whether or not legislators would be rewarded for taking up this cause, I think that there are legislators who are now being moved by the idea that even though this is not broadly available as protection, it's protection that should be available, and that they will be seen as having been on the right side of history if they work on this legislation. Until there's more of a tipping point, I'm not sure they get to cash in on those rewards immediately. It's later looking back and saying, wow, we were so archaic in thinking it was okay to be biased against fat people this way. Look at that vanguard senator in New Jersey, or, you know, look at that city councilman in New York who was really on the cutting edge. Look at the Elliott and Larson of Elliott Larson Act, and think about, wow, we really should have been paying more attention to what those people were doing. So I think there is glory there. I'm not sure the payoff of the glory is immediate quite yet.
Anyone else have any thoughts?
I think Tigress totally covered it. I totally agree.
Well, so now I have this other question. It's getting more towards what Robbie was saying. But so when I was preparing for my law review last year, so I asked fat rights activist Marilyn Wong what she saw as the biggest problem facing fat people and fat rights advocates. So she said that she thought it was a tie between lack of anti-discrimination protections for fat people and the ongoing dominance of medical and public health leaders and their associated agendas. Do you agree?
Does someone else want to go first on this one?
Sure, I can start. I do agree. I think it's a huge problem that we don't have protections legally. And also in certain areas themselves, even like absent the legal protection, not having the infrastructure, like it's a problem that when you go to a medical office, you can't sit in, you may not be able to sit in the chairs in the waiting room because they all have arms, or you can't use the image, you can't get an image because, the highest weight capacity MRI in, 500 miles of you is maybe 350 pounds, or you get denied for a surgery because of your BMI and the anesthesiologist won't put you under anesthesia, not having to do with anything about your health or your specific situation, but just based on your BMI. So I think, or not being able to sit in a classroom even because you're a student and the classroom has tables that are attached to chairs, and they're not large enough for all bodies. So I think the issue is, yes, not having the laws, and also not having the infrastructure, and not having, people realize that places need to work for all body sizes and shapes. And yeah, does anyone else have anything to add?
Yeah, I would say, yeah, I totally agree with you, Brandy. And I also think that I think it's just also like the weight stigma and anti-fat attitudes of society are also very, they kind of work together with, the kind of like the lack of infrastructure and, the lack of, I guess, anti-weight discrimination protections in like the medical profession and medical, I guess, medical healthcare facilities. So sometimes, yeah, like if you are denied surgery or healthcare based on your BMI, you are often, you may not know that to go and go and contact NAFA and find out what your rights are, or FLAIR, because you're so conditioned into accepting the weight stigma, like, oh, I am too fat to get the surgery, so maybe I need to, the doctor says I need to get weight loss surgery, and so then you're kind of pushed into that avenue. So I think that's another, I think they kind of work together as kind of as a danger. So it needs to, that's why I think it's very important. So thanks.
And I think we need to also always remember um, that while there are many people in the medical profession who undoubtedly are well-meaning in the way that they approach fat, um, they are often just as undereducated as the general public in terms of how they approach fat. There's not
Mhm.
enough training in medical schools about weight neutral treatment. There's not enough training in medical schools about weight sensitive treatment, about treatment that is specific to fat bodies. In
Mhm.
fact, medical students don't work on fat cadavers. Why? Because medical schools don't take fat cadavers. It's considered an inconvenience to have to deal with bodies that are that heavy once they've been embalmed. And so there are all these systemic ways in which that medical bias, even with the most well-meaning medical professionals, is still sort of baked into the system. And the way that our cultural uh, the weight that we as a culture put on um, the medical establishment as authority on things that they're actually not researching, that they're actually not established authorities are on, is certainly part of the issue. We get it's really, again, like I said in the beginning of the presentation, it's really hard to talk about the anything else about fat people without the health questions coming into play. And then it's really important because the health area is one of the areas where there's some of the most life threatening in an immediate way kinds of discrimination. And so when that is done, then with the assumption that the medical establishment is actually way better versed in this stuff than they are, then it's really hard to undo. I know there was a question in the chat about whether or not we are arguing that people should stop researching weight loss or stop researching about fat. We're not arguing at all that people should stop researching about fat. We're arguing that people should stop only doing biased research about fat. So much of the research that establishes our ideas culturally about whether fat is healthy or not is begins with the premise that fat is unhealthy, not that fat is neutral or even that fat is positive. There's research that shows that fat is medically positive. There are times when fat is life saving. We don't talk about that research, or when we bring up that research, it gets dismissed as now you're just quoting some quack, right? There's actual quackery in some of the research around weight loss um, and weight cycling, and so it's not that we don't want there to be research. We want there to be ethical examination of whether the research is actually neutral when it comes to fat bodies.
So I just want to jump in and I think that so part of the question is, can these two agendas coexist? Can a population weight loss agenda coexist with fat rights? And I guess in theory, but as I see it, and I'm speaking as from my own experiences, not when the power imbalance is this extreme. When you have if there were a scenario or a situation in which fat rights advocates and fat people were included and had were sufficiently included so that you could do responsible research in this area, I guess, I'd be much more in support of entertaining the idea that maybe there could be that environmental interventions for weight loss could coexist, with fat rights advocacy. And so in the paper, so I was my law review, and as I was asking NAFA and FLAIR about their opinions about environmental interventions for weight loss, for example, there's areas of convergence, it seems like, or possible. These aren't necessarily mutually exclusive agendas, but from my perspective as a disability advocate, and knowing the ways in which elite medical and public health establishments have run mental health agendas, public mental health agendas. I'm deeply suspicious of continuing the status quo, war, anti-obesity agendas without more of a balance of power. And there needs to be more conversations. And I wish Robbie, I don't know if you're on, I wish that we could have you videoed in. I don't know if there's a way to do that, but maybe if Georgetown Law Journal decides to sponsor a presentation, we can discuss this more. Anyway.
Well, Nick, I'd actually like to, you mentioned Robbie's question, and I'd actually like to address, I saw a couple questions from Robbie. Sorry, it's a little hard to keep up with all the questions coming in the Q&A box, but the one that I was thinking that we wanted to address, maybe this is what you were talking about, Nick. The question is, can you say anything about causation and perpetuation of fatness, and reasons why there are disproportionate metrics with respect to class, race, gender, sexuality, etc.? Is there a responsibility by fat activists to call for reducing causal and perpetuation factors? The responsibility for fat activists is not to reduce fat people's body size in order to gain access to anything in the world. And so our stance as fat liberationists really is that when it comes to protecting our rights, why we are fat is actually irrelevant. There can be a lot of dialogue around like, oh, well, if you're fat because you got sick, or if you're fat because you became disabled and then you couldn't exercise anymore, or if you're fat because, if you're fat because it's your ethnic heritage is a little curvier than everybody, that's a little different than if you're just fat because you're, you don't really want to buckle down and lose the weight, right? It's really hard to have any of these dialogues without them sort of deteriorating into that conversation about who is acceptably fat because it's not their fault versus who's fat for some other reason. And we just don't even want to entertain that conversation when we are talking about civil rights. Now, there are certainly intersections that have to do with classism, racism, gender, sexuality, that impact people's diets, that impact people's ability to access safe spaces for exercise, that impact people's stress level, which may have connections to how they store fat or get fat or are fat. All of those things are true. And as we work out those impacts, the idea is not to solve those things so we eliminate all fat people and then we don't have to worry about these issues of fat injustice. That's not the goal. And so it's interesting to me to know if people are fatter, which is also questionable, right? We change the way we talk about what fat is. Our understanding of how fat people are, especially in relationship to weight, we think has a much longer history than it actually does, because the accessibility of scales, it does not have as long of a history as most people think it does. So it's a relatively modern idea, within the last 140 years or so, that everybody knows what they weigh. And that we all know how everybody's weight is changing and who it's changing in relation to. When we talk about, Brandy mentioned some of the problems with BMI. When we talk about BMI and actuarial insurance tables that helped establish our concepts of what is healthy in terms of weight, where that line is between overweight and acceptable weight. When we talk about all of those things are based in gendered and racialized standards. And so even to talk about how much fatter we are or who's fatter than everybody else, all of it is laced with problematic history. And so in the contemporary setting, what we care most about is not establishing why people are fat, but establishing why we treat fat people poorly and what we're going to do about that. Because whatever reasons people are fat now, there might be different reasons why they're fat 100 years from now. But we want a 100-year-old law that protects them in their fat bodies, regardless of why they're fat. So, it's interesting to talk about causation, and there's a lot that has to do with medical research that really needs to separate the difference between correlation and causation. We talk about that a lot when we do talk about medical research. And it's interesting to talk about that both in terms of individual bodies and in terms of these social patterns that make some people fatter than others, or that group fat people differently than others. Some of the patterns around race and class are not necessarily who got made fat, but how the fat people got grouped together because some of those things. But anyway, it's a very long way of saying that in the end, the bottom line for us as advocates is we have a limited amount of energy and resource to spend on this, and we're not going to spend it on trying to figure out why people are fat. We're going to spend it trying to figure out how to treat fat people fairly, regardless of the causes.
Well, if I can follow up. So as you've been doing this, you know, I mean, you're spectacularly underfunded group, and you guys are my heroes. So just putting it out there. What has your experience been like trying to coalition with different members of the progressive community and with other potential allies in advancing fat justice?
It's a mixed experience over the course of NAFA's 50-some year history, and the movement's 50-some year history, that sometimes results in like really powerful coalitions, and sometimes results in a lot of cold shoulders. There is all of the other kinds of oppressive attitudes about other groups within fat community that we have had to work on and that we continually have to address. And there is anti-fatness in all other kinds of social justice movements. And the truth is, some of the most progressive thinkers have incredibly more limited thinking around anti-fatness as a social justice issue than they have around other issues. They will question the establishment, people who will question the establishment in all kinds of other ways. And then when they get to the category of fat, be like, oh, you should just exercise more, right? Or or, you know, people who are really concerned with things like environmental racism and food access and other things that we've mentioned, but that have bought into the idea that the reason those things are important is because obesity is killing the Black and brown people or the poor people, so we need to treat the obesity, not we need to treat all of the other factors. And so even within the groups that work on those issues, there is sometimes the attitude of, yeah, but not you guys, right? That's changing. We are seeing a warmer reception, even getting to doing this workshop. You know, I cannot honestly say that I know the history of NAFA having explicitly reached out to the ABA. I cannot say that. But I can say that 30 years ago, there are organizations that NAFA reached out to, and people assumed that NAFA was a joke organization, you know, or people said, that sounds important, but not as important as this other thing. Or people said, I will support that underneath, but I don't want to take the flack. You guys are going to get different comments on this YouTube video than you get on some of your other YouTube videos, right? And there are people who don't want to get in that fight. So there are a lot of reasons why folks that you would think would be natural partners with us, because of the internalized anti-fatness in their own organizations and movements, because of the mentalities around lack of resources and that they feel like we're scrapping it out instead of like we're sharing it. And also because, again, of issues in our own movement about not being intersectional enough to think about those other issues ourselves. There's a complicated blend of all of those things when it comes to why coalition building has been hard in the past. But it is changing. It's part of that sea change that I was talking about. We are getting a warmer reception when we reach out to people. We are getting more people who are willing to challenge some of their status quo ideas around diet culture, around fat and health, around perceptions of fat people as lazy or unintelligent. You know, there are people who didn't sign up for this workshop because why am I going to listen to some fat people justify, you know, being fat, right? But you all made it here. So there are definitely some different attitudes today than there have been over the course of our movement, which is part of what makes us really hopeful about seeing more of this legislative change enacted.
And, you know, just about the politicians, you know, or whether they would be rewarded or penalized. I mean, there's good evidence that fat people, you know, and not just fat advocates, they overwhelmingly support extending anti-discrimination protections to fat people. And they generally don't support environmental interventions to induce population weight loss. Now, and I guess you could argue that they just aren't well informed that they should be, in support of those interventions. But yeah, I'm really encouraged. I'm very encouraged that New Jersey and New York City have now, are now proposing, are now considering extending fat people anti-discrimination protections. I think that's great news. I don't understand why Massachusetts, it's been 10 years, and Massachusetts hasn't finally enacted its anti-discrimination protections yet. But I don't know what's holding up the legislation there.
Well, I think what holds it up is that sense that there are other political priorities. And the more we can work to get people understand how this issue is woven into those, basically every major political issue with the possible exception of gun legislation. Like, I haven't yet been able to make the connection to gun legislation, but in basically every other thing that dominates our thoughts in politics, things about money, things about how kids are raised and educated, things about healthcare, things about workplace, all of those things have elements of anti-fatness, and ways in which protecting fat people could give fat people better lives and make us more productive citizens. And our role is not to be productive citizens, right? It's to be respected as humans regardless of how productive we are. But for politicians, productive citizenry is usually a great motivation, right? And treating us better actually increases that. But people haven't made that connection enough. And I think, Massachusetts is not the only place where it's stalled, right? This legislation has been attempted in Nevada. It's been attempted before in New York. So that long history in Massachusetts of trying to get it passed and having it languish in committees a lot often has to do with something happens that makes this a higher priority for that person who's championing it, or that that moves it around in the priority list because everybody sees it as competing for resource. And so the more we can get people to understand it's not competing for resource, it's actually part of all those other things that you care about, I think the better we're going to do. And I think that's where we're starting to see some success now. We're very hopeful about these pending legislations. It's Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York State, and New York City. And and New York City is incredibly important because it would be the largest city on the list of municipalities, right? It would have tremendous symbolic importance to people all over the world in a way that the state of Massachusetts maybe doesn't mean as much to someone in Denmark as New York City does. And so we also see that our colleagues in Berlin who are doing this work are getting closer to passing law there. There has been some, legislation that has passed in South America. There are pending things in Canada that are happening as well. And so it's not just that there's a shift in the US, there's a global shift. And we're going to see, I think, more and more of that in the next couple of years. And once the snowball goes, I think we'll see a lot more of it. But yeah, keeping that snowball rolling, Nick, you're absolutely right. It has been tremendously hard. And we are, as you said, an under-resourced organization and an under-resourced movement. We're an incredibly small budget organization for the amount of work we do. We're an all-volunteer board. We rely on the donation of time and expertise from folks like yourself and folks like all of you here. So, so I think that the more we can build those coalitions, the better it's going to go.
And I know you guys have sign-on letters, and I think you're going to have sign-on letters so that people can, in support of extending anti-fat people anti-discrimination protection, can sign on and petition their elected officials. So thank you guys so much. We're about out of time. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for joining us for this free webinar. We want to express our gratitude to this esteemed group of panelists. You're all doing incredible work. The section of Civil Rights and Social Justice provides free webinars on resources for legal professionals and advocates nationwide. We hope that this helps you in your work. And again, if you can, please consider joining and becoming active in the ABA. You may do so at ambar.org/CRSJ. Best of luck in your work, everyone, and please stay safe. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you.